The morning sun cast long shadows across the Nebraska plains as Samuel Morrison wiped the sweat from his weathered brow, the salt stinging his eyes as he surveyed the endless expanse of prairie that had become both his home and his prison. At 42, he had spent the last 15 years working this unforgiving land, carving out a modest existence from soil that seemed determined to reject every seed he planted with the stubborn persistence of a land that had never known the plow. His calloused hands, scarred by countless encounters with barbed wire, rough timber, and the sharp edges of farming tools, told the story of countless dawns spent behind a temperamental plow, countless evenings mending fences that the relentless prairie wind seemed to tear down as quickly as he could repair them. The nearest neighbor, old Henrik Johansson, lived 12 miles east across terrain that could turn treacherous without warning. And the closest town, a dusty collection of wooden buildings optimistically called Cedar Ridge, was a full day's ride through territory that had seen more than its share of conflict between settlers and the native tribes who had called this land home for generations beyond memory. Samuel had heard the stories whispered in the general store and the saloon, tales of raids, of families found slaughtered, of crops burned and livestock stolen in the dark of night. But he had also heard other stories, quieter ones, of settlers who had cheated tribes out of their land, of promises broken and treaties ignored by men who saw the native peoples as nothing more than obstacles to progress. Samuel had always kept to himself, speaking only when necessary at the general store, where Mrs. Patterson would eye him with the mixture of pity and suspicion reserved for bachelors who lived alone on the frontier, nodding politely to the few travelers who passed his way on their journey to somewhere more promising than his isolated patch of Nebraska prairie. He had learned that in this harsh landscape, where the winter winds could freeze a man solid and the summer heat could drive him mad with thirst, survival often depended on avoiding trouble rather than seeking it out. His small farmhouse, built with his own hands from timber he had hauled from the distant hills during his second winter on the plains, stood like a lonely sentinel against the vast expanse of prairie grass that stretched to the horizon in every direction, broken only by the occasional cottonwood tree marking the path of a creek or the distant silhouette of a hawk circling in the endless sky. The house itself was a testament to Samuel's determination and practical nature. 2 rooms with thick walls designed to withstand the fierce prairie storms, a stone fireplace that could heat the entire structure during the brutal winter months, and windows positioned to catch the morning light while providing clear views of the surrounding landscape. He had dug the well himself, going down 30 feet through clay and rock until he struck the sweet water that meant the difference between life and death on the plains. His barn, smaller but built with the same careful attention to detail, housed his 2 horses, a handful of chickens, and the cow that provided him with milk and the occasional luxury of fresh butter. Before we continue with Samuel's extraordinary story, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what city you're watching from. Your support helps us bring you more incredible tales from the American frontier, stories of courage, friendship, and the bonds that can form between the most unlikely people in the most challenging circumstances. It was on a particularly quiet Tuesday afternoon in late August, while Samuel was repairing a section of his fence that had been damaged by a recent storm that had torn across the plains with the fury of an angry god, that he first saw her. The storm had been one of those sudden, violent affairs that the prairie was famous for. One moment the sky had been clear and blue, the next it was black with clouds that seemed to boil with malevolent energy. The wind had howled like a living thing, driving rain horizontally across the landscape and sending his chickens scurrying for shelter while his horses whinnied nervously in the barn. A young Native American girl, no more than 16 or 17 years old, emerged from the tall grass near the creek that bordered his property like a vision from another world. She moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent her entire life in harmony with the natural world, her feet making no sound on the soft earth as she approached. But there was something in her posture that spoke of urgency, perhaps even desperation. Her movements were quick and alert, like those of a deer that senses the presence of wolves, but has not yet decided whether to flee or stand its ground. The girl wore traditional buckskin clothing that had been crafted with obvious care and skill, the leather soft and supple from countless hours of careful preparation, adorned with intricate beadwork that caught the afternoon sunlight and threw it back in tiny rainbows of color. The patterns were complex and beautiful, telling stories that Samuel could not read, but somehow understood, spoke of family, tradition, and a connection to the land that went back countless generations. Her long black hair was braided with small feathers and colored threads, and around her neck hung a necklace of carved bone and polished stones that spoke of status within her tribe. But what struck Samuel most was the look in her dark eyes, a mixture of determination and fear that he recognized all too well from his own reflection during those first brutal winters on the plains. It was the same expression he had seen in his own face during his first winter on the plains, when the isolation and harsh conditions had nearly broken his spirit and sent him fleeing back to the relative comfort of civilization. It was the look of someone who had been pushed to the edge of desperation but refused to give up, someone who would risk everything for the chance to save what mattered most. She approached slowly, her hands visible and empty in the universal gesture of peaceful intent, speaking in her native tongue with words that Samuel could not understand, but whose meaning seemed clear enough through the urgency in her voice and the pleading expression in her eyes. She was asking for help, that much was obvious, but the nature of that help remained a mystery that would soon unfold in ways Samuel could never have imagined. Without thinking, Samuel set down his tools and walked toward her, stopping at a respectful distance that would allow either of them to retreat if necessary. The girl pointed toward the horizon, then to herself, then made a gesture that Samuel interpreted as shooting, her hands positioned as if holding a rifle, one eye closed, as if taking aim. She wanted to learn how to use a firearm, a request that sent a chill down Samuel's spine as he considered the implications. Samuel hesitated, his mind racing through the potential consequences of what she was asking. Teaching a Native American to shoot could be seen as an act of treason by some of his fellow settlers, many of whom viewed all tribes as potential threats to be eliminated rather than people to be understood. The territorial government had strict laws about providing weapons or training to native peoples, laws that carried severe penalties for those foolish enough to ignore them. But looking at this young woman, seeing the desperation in her eyes and the way she glanced nervously over her shoulder toward the distant hills as if expecting pursuit, Samuel made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He nodded slowly and gestured for her to follow him to his cabin, his heart pounding as he realized he was crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. As they walked toward his house, Samuel found himself studying his unexpected visitor more closely. She was small and slight, but there was a strength in her bearing that spoke of a hard life lived close to the earth. Her hands, he noticed, bore the calluses of someone accustomed to physical work, and there was an alertness in her movements that suggested she was constantly aware of her surroundings in a way that only came from living in genuine danger. Over the next several hours, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon and painted the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, Samuel taught the girl the basics of handling his old Springfield rifle, a weapon that had served him well during his years on the frontier. The rifle was a single-shot breech-loader, reliable and accurate in the hands of someone who knew how to use it, but requiring skill and patience to master. Samuel had purchased it from a traveling gun merchant during his second year on the plains, trading a month's worth of eggs and a side of bacon for the weapon that had since saved his life on more than one occasion. She was a remarkably quick learner, her natural coordination and keen eyesight making her a natural marksman in a way that surprised and impressed Samuel. Her hands, though small, were steady and sure as she learned to load the rifle, her movements becoming more confident with each repetition. When she first fired the weapon, the recoil knocked her back a step, but she quickly adjusted her stance and was soon placing shots with an accuracy that would have been impressive in an experienced hunter. They communicated through gestures and simple words, with Samuel slowly learning that her name was Ayana, which she explained through a combination of English words and expressive hand movements meant eternal blossom in her language. The name suited her, Samuel thought, as he watched her practice with the rifle. There was something about her that spoke of resilience and beauty persisting despite harsh conditions, like the wildflowers that somehow managed to bloom on the prairie despite the wind and drought and endless challenges of frontier life. As the lesson progressed and the shadows grew longer, Samuel began to understand more about Ayana's situation through her broken English and increasingly expressive gestures. Her village, she conveyed with obvious distress, was in terrible danger. A rival tribe, one known throughout the territory for its aggressive expansion and brutal tactics, had been moving through the region like a plague, attacking smaller settlements and forcing survivors to join their ranks or face death. These raiders, she explained through a combination of words and dramatic gestures, showed no mercy to those who resisted and no respect for the traditional boundaries that had kept peace between tribes for generations. Ayana's people, she made clear through her earnest explanations, were peaceful farmers and hunters, people who had lived in harmony with the land and their neighbors for countless generations. They were ill-equipped to defend themselves against such organized violence, having relied for protection on treaties and traditional agreements that meant nothing to raiders who recognized no authority but strength. Her father, she explained with obvious pride and love, was the village chief, a man respected for his wisdom and fairness, but faced with an impossible situation that threatened to destroy everything he had worked to protect. The girl's father, she continued with increasing urgency, had sent her on this desperate mission to learn the ways of the white man's weapons so that she could return and teach others. It was a gamble born of desperation, one that required tremendous courage from someone so young and inexperienced in the ways of the world beyond her village. Samuel found himself deeply moved by her story and impressed by her determination to save her people, even at the risk of her own life, as darkness fell across the prairie like a blanket, bringing with it the familiar sounds of night, the distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of small creatures in the grass, the whisper of wind through the cottonwood trees by the creek. Samuel offered Ayana food and shelter for the night. His cabin was small but warm, and he had enough supplies to share a meal with someone in need. But she declined with obvious regret, explaining through gestures and her limited English that she needed to return to her village immediately. Every moment of delay, she made clear, could mean the difference between life and death for her people. Before departing into the darkness that seemed to swallow the prairie whole, Ayana pressed a small beaded bracelet into Samuel's hand, a token of gratitude that he would treasure for the rest of his life. The bracelet was a work of art, with tiny beads arranged in patterns that told a story he could not read, but somehow understood, spoke of friendship, respect, and the bonds that could form between people of different worlds. The beadwork was incredibly fine, each tiny piece perfectly placed to create a design that seemed to shimmer and change in the lamplight. Samuel watched as Ayana disappeared into the darkness, her slight figure swallowed by the vast prairie night that stretched endlessly in all directions. He stood there for a long time, the bracelet warm in his palm, wondering if he had done the right thing and whether the skills he had taught her would be enough to make a difference in whatever conflict awaited her people. The frontier was a place where survival often meant making impossible choices, where the line between right and wrong was as shifting and uncertain as the prairie wind that never seemed to stop blowing. That night, Samuel lay awake in his small cabin, staring at the rough-hewn ceiling beams that he had cut and shaped with his own hands, and listening to the familiar sounds of the plains that had become the soundtrack of his solitary life. The wind whispered through the gaps in the walls with a sound like distant voices. And somewhere in the darkness, a night-bird called with a cry that seemed to echo his own loneliness. He thought about Ayana and her people, wondering if the skills he had taught her would be enough to make a difference in whatever conflict awaited them, and whether his decision to help her would bring consequences he was not prepared to face. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with a crispness in the air that spoke of the approaching autumn and the harsh winter that would follow. Samuel rose early, as was his custom developed over years of frontier life, and stepped outside to begin his daily chores that kept his small farm functioning. The morning routine was always the same. Check on the animals, draw water from the well, inspect the fences and buildings for damage from the night's wind, and plan the day's work based on the weather and the season. But as he opened his cabin door and looked out across his property, expecting to see nothing but the familiar expanse of prairie grass waving in the morning breeze, he froze in absolute astonishment at a sight that would be burned into his memory for the rest of his life. Where yesterday there had been nothing but empty prairie stretching to the horizon, now stood the most incredible sight he had ever witnessed in his 42 years of life. Arranged in perfect formation across his land, as far as the eye could see, were 350 Native American warriors mounted on horses that stood motionless as statues in the morning light. The sight was so overwhelming, so completely unexpected, that Samuel's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. The warriors wore full war paint and traditional battle dress. Their weapons, bows, lances, and war clubs, held ready but not raised in immediate threat. The morning sun glinted off painted faces and polished weapons, creating a display of power and organization that spoke of a military force capable of overwhelming any settlement in the territory. At the front of this impressive assembly sat a tall, dignified man whose bearing and elaborate headdress marked him unmistakably as a chief of considerable importance. His horse, a magnificent painted stallion, stood perfectly still as its rider surveyed Samuel's modest farm with eyes that seemed to take in every detail. The chief's headdress was a work of art, with eagle feathers arranged in a pattern that spoke of great deeds and high honor, and his face was painted with designs that Samuel could not interpret but somehow understood, spoke of authority and power. Samuel's heart pounded as he tried to process what he was seeing, his mind racing through possibilities and consequences. His first instinct was to reach for his rifle, but something in the warrior's posture told him that this was not an attack. They sat their horses with the patience of men who had come for a specific purpose, their eyes fixed on his small cabin with an intensity that was both intimidating and strangely respectful. There was no hostility in their bearing, no sense of imminent violence, but rather the controlled power of a force that could destroy everything in its path, but had chosen restraint. As Samuel stood frozen in his doorway, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what was happening, the chief raised his hand and spoke a single word in his native tongue. The word carried across the morning air with the authority of absolute command, and immediately one of the warriors dismounted and began walking toward the cabin. Samuel's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the graceful gait immediately. It was Ayana, though she now wore the war paint and ceremonial dress of her people, transformed from the desperate girl of yesterday into a warrior princess who moved with confidence and purpose. She approached to within speaking distance and called out in her accented but clear English, her voice carrying easily across the morning air. "Samuel Morrison, my father, Chief Standing Bear, wishes to speak with you. You have shown kindness to his daughter and respect for our people. He comes not as an enemy, but as one who would honor a debt that can never be fully repaid." Samuel's mind raced as he tried to understand the situation, the implications of what was happening slowly sinking in. Slowly, fighting against every instinct that told him to retreat to the safety of his cabin, he stepped out into the morning air and walked toward the assembled warriors, his hands visible and empty in a gesture of peaceful intent. The sheer number of mounted fighters was overwhelming, more Native Americans than he had ever seen in one place, representing a show of force that could have easily overwhelmed any settlement in the territory and left nothing but ashes and memories. Chief Standing Bear dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who had spent his entire life on horseback and walked forward to meet Samuel halfway between the cabin and the assembled warriors. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, with silver threading through his long black hair and the kind of weathered dignity that came from a lifetime of leadership and difficult decisions. His face bore the lines of someone who had seen much sorrow and much joy, who had led his people through times of peace and times of war, and who carried the weight of their survival on his shoulders every day. When he spoke, his English was formal but clear, learned through years of necessary interaction with white traders and government officials who had slowly encroached on his people's traditional lands. "Samuel Morrison," the chief began, his voice carrying across the silent prairie with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "Yesterday you showed my daughter kindness when you could have shown fear. You taught her skills that may save our people when you could have turned her away. You treated her with respect when others of your kind have shown us only hatred and suspicion." Samuel found his voice. Though it came out rougher than he intended, his throat dry with nervousness and awe at the situation in which he found himself. "She needed help, Chief Standing Bear. Any decent man would have done the same thing, regardless of the color of her skin or the language she spoke." The chief smiled slightly at this response, an expression that transformed his stern features and revealed the warmth that lay beneath the necessary armor of leadership. "You speak of decency, but we have learned through bitter experience that decent men are rare on this frontier. My daughter returned to our village last night with knowledge that may help us defend our home against those who would destroy us. But more than that, she returned with stories of a white man who showed her humanity when he could have shown her the door." Chief Standing Bear gestured toward the assembled warriors with obvious pride, and Samuel could see that these were not just fighters, but fathers, sons, and brothers who had families and homes to protect. "These men have ridden through the night to be here this morning, leaving their own families and responsibilities to honor what you have done. They come not to make war, but to make an offer that we hope you will consider carefully." The chief continued, his voice growing more serious as he outlined the proposal that would change Samuel's life forever. "We know that you live alone on this land, that you struggle against the same harsh conditions that challenge all who try to make a life on these plains. We know that you face the same dangers that threaten all isolated settlers, raiders, weather, wild animals, and the countless other perils of frontier life." Samuel listened intently as the chief continued, his words carrying the weight of a formal treaty between nations. "We offer you our protection and our friendship, not as a temporary arrangement, but as a permanent bond between our peoples. The warriors you see before you will ensure that no harm comes to you or your property, one who judges others by their character rather than the color of their skin or the customs they follow." The magnitude of what was being offered began to sink in, and Samuel felt his knees grow weak as he considered the implications. In a territory where isolated farmers lived in constant fear of raids, weather, and the countless other dangers of frontier life, the protection of 350 warriors was beyond valuable. It was the difference between survival and destruction, between a life lived in constant fear and one lived in security and peace. But Samuel realized that this offer came with implications that extended far beyond his own safety and comfort. Accepting the protection of Chief Standing Bear's tribe would mark him as an ally to the Native Americans, a designation that could make him an enemy to many of his fellow settlers who viewed all tribes as threats to be eliminated. It was a choice that would define not just his future, but his very identity in this harsh and unforgiving land where allegiances could mean the difference between life and death. As Samuel considered his response, weighing the risks and benefits of a decision that could not be undone, he looked out at the assembled warriors and saw something that surprised him. In their painted faces and traditional dress, behind the weapons and the obvious military organization, he saw not the savage enemies that frontier folklore had taught him to fear, but men who were fathers, sons, and brothers, people who loved their families and their way of life just as fiercely as any settler loved his own family and dreams of prosperity. "Chief Standing Bear," Samuel said finally, his voice growing stronger with conviction as he made the decision that would define the rest of his life. "I am honored by your offer, more honored than I can express in words. Yesterday I helped your daughter because it was the right thing to do, because she was a human being in need of help. Today I accept your friendship for the same reason, because it is right and because I believe that understanding between our peoples is possible." The chief nodded solemnly and extended his hand in the white man's gesture of agreement, a symbol of the bridge being built between two worlds that had too often seen each other as enemies. As Samuel grasped it, he felt the calluses and scars that marked Standing Bear as a man who had worked with his hands, fought for his people, and carried the weight of leadership through countless difficult decisions. It was the handshake of equals, of men who understood the value of honor and the importance of keeping one's word. With a gesture from their chief, the assembled warriors began to disperse, but not before each one rode past Samuel's cabin in a show of respect that left him deeply moved and humbled. As they departed, their horses' hooves thundering across the prairie in a sound like distant thunder, Chief Standing Bear explained that a small group of warriors would remain nearby, invisible but vigilant, ensuring Samuel's safety while respecting his privacy and independence. Ayana was among the last to leave, and she approached Samuel one final time before mounting her horse, a beautiful pinto mare that danced nervously under her light touch. "Thank you," she said simply, but the gratitude in her eyes conveyed far more than words could express. "You have given my people hope when we had none, and you have given me the skills to protect those I love. We will not forget what you have done, and neither will our children or our children's children." As the sun climbed higher in the morning sky and the last of the warriors disappeared into the vast expanse of prairie, becoming one with the landscape they knew so well, Samuel stood alone once again on his land. But everything had changed in ways both visible and invisible. The isolation that had once defined his existence had been replaced by a connection to something larger than himself, a bond forged not through shared heritage or common language, but through the simple recognition of shared humanity and the courage to act on that recognition. In the days and weeks that followed, Samuel's life took on a new rhythm that reflected his changed circumstances. His crops grew better than they ever had before, protected from the destructive raids that plagued other settlements in the territory. The small group of warriors who remained nearby proved to be not just protectors, but teachers, sharing their knowledge of the land and its seasons in ways that helped Samuel become a more successful farmer. They taught him which plants could be used for medicine, how to read the signs that predicted weather changes, and where to find the best water during dry spells. Travelers began to seek out his farm, drawn by stories of the white man who had earned the friendship and protection of Chief Standing Bear's tribe. Some came out of curiosity, others out of necessity, but all found in Samuel a man who had been transformed by his experience into something more than he had been before. His cabin became a neutral ground, where disputes could be resolved peacefully, and where understanding could grow between peoples who had too often seen each other only as enemies. Samuel became a bridge between two worlds, helping to facilitate trade and communication between the Native Americans and the growing number of settlers in the territory. His unique position allowed him to serve as a translator not just of languages, but of cultures, helping each side understand the motivations and fears of the other. Through his efforts, several conflicts that might have led to bloodshed were resolved through negotiation and compromise. Years later, when Samuel was an old man with silver in his beard and lines around his eyes that spoke of a life well lived, he would often sit on his porch in the evening and remember that morning when he woke to find 350 warriors standing before his house. He would finger the beaded bracelet that Ayana had given him, now worn smooth by decades of handling, and marvel at how a single act of kindness had transformed not just his own life, but the lives of countless others who had benefited from the peace and understanding that grew from that moment of connection. The lesson of Samuel Morrison's story echoes across the generations like the wind across the prairie, that in a world too often divided by fear and misunderstanding, the simple choice to see the humanity in others can create bonds stronger than any force that seeks to divide us. On the harsh frontier of the American West, where survival often seemed to require hardness and suspicion, one quiet farmer proved that sometimes the greatest strength comes from opening your heart to those who are different from yourself, and that the courage to do what is right can change the world in ways we never imagined possible.